The story of the Ghost Army begins in the darkest years of World War II, when the United States and its allies were trying to break the iron grip of Nazi Germany over Europe. By 1943, the U.S. military command understood that brute force alone was not enough to defeat an enemy as experienced, disciplined, and deeply entrenched as the German army. They needed something different, something invisible, unexpected, and utterly deceptive. That idea led to one of the most extraordinary and secretive units in modern military history, a group of artists, designers, actors, sound engineers, and creative minds who would go to war armed not with guns, but with imagination. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known quietly and mysteriously as the Ghost Army. The Ghost Army was assembled not because the United States lacked soldiers, but because it needed illusions. Germany's intelligence network was strong, and their commanders relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, and rapid response. If the Allies could fool German commanders into seeing entire divisions where none existed, they could manipulate battlefield decisions. They could draw forces away from real locations and protect the advancing Allied troops who were fighting and dying on the front lines. This mission required deception on a scale never seen before in warfare. The idea for the Ghost Army was inspired partly by British deception efforts in North Africa, where inflatable tanks and phony camps had misled German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. However, the Americans decided to push the concept far beyond anything attempted before. Their new unit would combine visual illusions, sound deception, fake radio traffic, and psychological warfare. It would function like a traveling theatrical troupe whose performances determined life or death for thousands of soldiers. Recruiting for the Ghost Army was unlike recruiting for any other U.S. Army unit. Instead of looking for strong farm boys or seasoned mechanics, the military pulled talent from art schools, advertising companies, Hollywood studios, technical colleges, and even the fashion world. Many of the men who joined were painters, sculptors, illustrators, photographers, sound technicians, actors, and set designers. They had never imagined that their creative skills would be used on battlefields in France, Belgium, and Germany, but they accepted the challenge with a sense of purpose and curiosity. When the unit was formed in 1944, the men trained with tools that seemed strangely out of place in a military camp. Inflatable rubber tanks were tested in open fields. Engineers practiced building fake artillery positions using cardboard and canvas. Sound crews experimented with massive speakers that could send recorded tank noises up to 15 miles across the countryside. Radio operators learned to mimic the communication styles of real military divisions, copying their rhythms, call signs, and habits so precisely that German listeners would believe entire units were moving. Everything about the Ghost Army was designed to appear real from a distance. The inflatable tanks were full-size replicas of Sherman tanks, complete with realistic shadows and paint patterns. Camouflage artists studied how sunlight moved across steel and mud, then recreated those effects on rubber. Artillery guns, jeeps, and armored vehicles were reproduced with lightweight materials so that 4 men could lift a tank and carry it across a field. The deception had to withstand aerial observation, ground scouts, and German intelligence evaluations. Nothing could look cheap, fake, or theatrical. The illusions had to mimic war itself. The sound deception unit played an equally crucial role. Engineers recorded audio of tanks starting, engines revving, treads clanking, and soldiers shouting. They created entire libraries of battlefield noise. Using massive amplifiers mounted on trucks, they blasted these recordings across the night landscapes of France, making it seem as if thousands of troops and hundreds of tanks were assembling in the darkness. German scouts listening in the distance would hear what they thought was a massive division preparing for an assault. Radio deception was the third branch of the Ghost Army's strategy. Skilled radio operators spent countless hours studying the communication habits of real units. They learned how often messages were sent, how long typical transmissions lasted, and what kinds of codes were used. They then reproduced these patterns, sending fake radio traffic that would convince German intelligence that entire divisions were camped in areas where only a handful of ghost army troops actually stood. The Germans trusted their electronic ears, and the ghost army used that trust against them. The unit's psychological warfare teams added another layer to the deception. They created fake shoulder patches for divisions that weren't there, produced counterfeit paperwork, and built phony headquarters complete with signs, tents, and prop. Soldiers acted the part of infantry officers, engineers, and tank commanders, wandering through French villages and German-occupied zones talking loudly about non-existent troop movements. Even local civilians were misled, and if rumors spread, they often reached German ears quickly. All these techniques came together in a kind of military magic, a deadly performance meant to mislead and confuse. The Ghost Army's first real test came shortly after D-Day, when Allied troops were pushing inland from the beaches of Normandy. The Germans were fiercely resisting and often counterattacking, and every deception that could draw enemy troops away from real Allied positions would save countless lives. The Ghost Army deployed inflatable tanks, fake artillery, and sound systems near the French town of Brest, creating the illusion of an entire U.S. division preparing to attack. German scouts reported seeing large formations of armor. Their commanders moved reinforcements to defend Brest, weakening their presence in other crucial sectors. For the U.S. Army, this meant easier advances in areas where the real battles were happening. The Ghost Army performed their first illusion flawlessly, proving that deception could be just as powerful as firepower. As the Allies advanced across France, the Ghost Army traveled with them, constantly creating new illusions wherever needed. To the German army, they appeared unpredictable and mysterious. One moment a division of tanks would seem to materialize in the countryside, and the next day it vanished without explanation. German intelligence reports repeatedly referenced sightings of units that did not exist, evidence that the illusions were working perfectly. The challenges the Ghost Army faced were enormous. They had to set up and dismantle massive illusions in a matter of hours, often under the threat of nearby enemy troops. Inflatable tanks could be punctured by stray branches, barbed wire, or sharp metal. Weather conditions made camouflage difficult. In some areas, civilians wandered too close to the installations, and the soldiers had to improvise explanations without revealing their true purpose. Above all, the greatest danger was discovery. If German soldiers ever realized that the tanks were made of rubber and the artillery was hollow, the entire operation would collapse, and the real Allied troops would be exposed. But the Ghost Army worked with remarkable discipline and professionalism. They developed an internal culture of secrecy, creativity, and mutual trust. Despite being one of the most unusual units in the U.S. Army, they operated with military precision. Many soldiers kept sketchbooks, painting the landscapes of Europe between missions or documenting their experiences through drawings. These artistic records, created while bombs fell in the distance, would later become priceless historical evidence of the unit's work. The Ghost Army's most important mission came in 1945, during the final push into Germany. As Allied forces moved eastward, they faced fierce German resistance along the Siegfried Line. The U.S. Ninth Army needed to cross the Rhine River, one of the most heavily defended natural barriers in Europe. The Germans believed the Allies would cross at several predictable points, and they concentrated their forces accordingly. The Ghost Army's job was to mislead the enemy, drawing German troops away from the real crossing site. To accomplish this, the Ghost Army staged one of the largest deception operations of the war. They created an entire fake army group along the Rhine. Inflatable tanks lined the riverbank, sound trucks blasted the noise of pontoon bridges being built, and radio operators sent streams of fake messages describing troop movements and supply drop. Actors posing as high-ranking officers visited local towns, overflowing with confidence, allowing German spies to overhear their conversations. Patrols were staged, campfires were lit, and fake beacons were placed along the river. German reconnaissance planes circling overhead reported what looked like a massive American buildup. German commanders reacted predictably. They redeployed troops to face this phantom army. Meanwhile, the real U.S. forces crossed the Rhine miles away with far fewer casualties than expected. The deception worked so flawlessly that some German units continued waiting for an attack from the Ghost Army days after the real crossing had already succeeded. This event became one of the greatest triumphs of military deception in modern history. Without firing a shot, the Ghost Army had saved thousands of Allied soldiers and hastened the collapse of Nazi Germany. Their work, though invisible, was essential. The success of the Ghost Army along the Rhine did not happen by accident. It was the result of months of preparation, experimentation, and constant refinement. As 1944 turned into 1945, the unit evolved into a highly skilled deception machine capable of manipulating the perceptions of German commanders with remarkable precision. They learned from every operation what worked, what didn't, and how to adapt to the rapidly changing battlefield. The unit moved so often and so quietly that even many American soldiers had no idea they existed. Some thought they were a strange engineering unit, others believed they were an observation team, and a few suspected they might be some kind of secret research group. In reality, they were an army built entirely on shadows and illusions. As the war intensified, the Ghost Army often found itself operating dangerously close to the front lines. Deception required proximity. If they were too far from real combat zones, the Germans would not believe what they saw or heard. This meant the unit frequently deployed within artillery range, and in some operations, even within small arms range. Their mission demanded that they pretend to be a large military force without ever having the real firepower to defend themselves. If a German unit decided to attack one of their fake tank battalions, the Ghost Army had little more than rifles and carbines to protect themselves, and an inflatable tank would be no more use than a balloon in a firefight. Because of this, every deployment carried the risk of total disaster. The men of the Ghost Army had to move quickly, set up their illusions with speed, then disappear before the Germans could respond aggressively. It was a delicate dance. Appear large enough to attract enemy attention, but not long enough to provoke a direct assault. Timing was everything, and misjudgment could cost lives. One of the most challenging missions the unit faced was during the Battle of the Bulge in winter 1944, when Germany launched a massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. The attack caught the Allies off guard and created chaos across the front. Entire divisions were pushed back, and critical supply routes were threatened. The Ghost Army was pulled into the freezing forests and snow-covered fields to help stabilize the situation by confusing German intelligence and slowing their advances. The cold during this period was brutal. Soldiers described temperatures so low that the rubber on the inflatable tanks became stiff and brittle. Setting up the illusions in such conditions was physically painful. Hands froze, valves jammed, and air pumps malfunctioned. Snowstorms interfered with visibility, making it harder to create convincing scenes. Yet the Ghost Army adapted. They used snow to help camouflage their positions, built fake vehicle tracks with shovels, and carved footprints to mimic troop movements. The sound crews blasted recordings of tank engines into the frozen night air, letting the echoes bounce through the trees, creating the impression of armored columns gathering for a counterattack. During this critical period, the unit deployed a wide array of tricks. One group constructed dummy artillery positions using logs painted to look like cannons. Another team built fake fuel depots, rows of empty barrels arranged to look like overflowing supply stations. By placing these illusions near strategic routes, they successfully convinced German commanders that the Allies had more reinforcements in the area than they actually had. This diverted enemy forces, buying precious time for American troops to reorganize after the shock of the German assault. Even German prisoners captured during the Battle of the Bulge later confirmed that the illusions worked. Many said they believed large American armored groups were preparing counterattacks in sectors where, in reality, only the Ghost Army was present. These reports served as priceless validation for the unit, proof that their work was not only clever but effective. As winter turned to early spring, the Ghost Army continued moving deeper into Europe. Their missions became more ambitious and more frequent as the German military crumbled under the weight of Allied advances. The closer they got to Germany's heartland, the more desperate the fighting became. Towns were reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, and the roads clogged with refugees. Yet the Ghost Army pushed forward, carrying with them an entire arsenal of illusions. To support the rapid movement of Allied forces, the Ghost Army developed mobile deception camps that could be set up and dismantled quickly. They refined techniques for creating the illusion of large encampments using only a few dozen men. Tents were arranged in patterns that mimicked real infantry divisions. Fake cook smoke was produced using small heaters and special chemicals. Vehicles were repositioned constantly to simulate heavy traffic. Soldiers walked in loops to create the appearance of multiple platoons moving through an area. Everything was coordinated with precision to deceive enemy scouts. The Ghost Army also mastered the art of staged visibility. In some operations, they intentionally allowed German reconnaissance aircraft to spot them. Soldiers would march in open fields, trucks would drive in circles to simulate convoys, and inflatable tanks would be positioned just long enough to be photographed before being moved. These carefully timed exposures planted fake intelligence into German decision-making channels, steering enemy commanders toward false conclusions. One of the lesser-known aspects of the Ghost Army's work involved psychological deception directed at civilians. As the Allies moved through Belgium and eastern France, the unit often left behind artifacts designed to spread rumors. These included fake documents, counterfeit division maps, and fabricated correspondence. The purpose was not to fool civilians themselves, but to exploit natural information channels. Civilians talked to other civilians, and sometimes their conversations reached German ears. Every rumor, every overheard conversation, every whisper could be used to reinforce the illusions created on the battlefield. Despite their unusual skills, the soldiers of the Ghost Army lived under difficult conditions. They slept in canvas tents, marched through mud, survived artillery bombardments, and faced the constant threat of enemy attack. Many of them were young, just 18 or 19 years old, yet they carried a responsibility far beyond their age. Their operations affected the movement of entire divisions, influenced the outcome of major battles, and saved lives on a scale they could not fully comprehend at the time. There were moments when the danger came far too close. During one mission near the Moselle River, the unit set up an elaborate deception to draw German fire away from real American positions. The Germans responded more aggressively than expected, launching a heavy artillery bombardment. Inflatable tanks burst under the impact. Dummy artillery shattered. Rubber vehicles flew into the air as shrapnel tore through them. The Ghost Army soldiers were forced to dive for cover behind the very illusions they created. Miraculously, casualties were minimal, but the message was clear: discovery meant death. In other operations, German patrols nearly stumbled upon the unit's fake installations. Quick thinking saved the day. Soldiers disguised themselves as military police and redirected the patrols. In one case, a small group of Ghost Army soldiers pretended to be engineers laying mines, distracting the Germans from noticing a nearby inflatable tank battalion. The success of these measures depended entirely on improvisation, courage, and the ability to act convincingly under pressure. At times, the Ghost Army's interactions with civilians created unexpected complications. In one French village, curious locals wandered too close to an inflatable tank and poked it with a stick, amazed that such a massive vehicle could feel so soft. Soldiers quickly ushered them away, warning that the tank was dangerous and unstable. The truth was that one careless action could expose the entire deception. This episode highlighted the delicate balance the Ghost Army had to maintain, close enough to be seen by the enemy, but not so close that the wrong person discovered the truth. As the Allied forces pushed toward the Rhine, the Ghost Army's operations intensified. The unit took part in over 20 major deception missions, each one shaping the movements of German forces. Their efforts often determined where battles happened, and where they didn't. In many cases, the Ghost Army prevented battles entirely by convincing the enemy that certain areas were too heavily defended to attack. One of the most dramatic examples occurred near the town of Krefeld, where the Ghost Army impersonated the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. The deception was so convincing that German commanders redirected artillery fire and infantry reinforcements away from the real 30th Division, allowing it to break through enemy lines with far fewer casualties. The Ghost Army's actions turned what could have been a deadly confrontation into a relatively swift Allied victory. As the war neared its end, the Ghost Army faced their largest and most critical mission yet, Operation Viersen. This mission was designed to mislead the Germans about the location of a major Allied crossing over the Rhine River. Everything the unit had learned over the past year would be tested. The stakes were immense. If the deception failed, tens of thousands of American troops might walk into a deadly trap. The Ghost Army built fake tank parks, erected phony headquarters, set up dummy artillery, blasted sound effects every night, and transmitted false radio traffic around the clock. Soldiers wandered conspicuously through nearby towns pretending to belong to units that existed only on paper. Entire landscapes were transformed into illusions. German intelligence took the bait. Believing a major assault was imminent at the Ghost Army's fake location, they shifted troops, artillery, and defensive resources to the wrong sector. Meanwhile, miles away, real American forces crossed the Rhine with minimal resistance. It was one of the most brilliant deceptions of the entire war, and one of the least known. Operation Viersen effectively marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Rhine crossing shattered the last major defensive line standing between Allied forces and the German heartland. Within weeks, American, British, and Soviet armies converged on Germany from all directions. The Ghost Army had played a decisive role not through violence, but through creativity, daring, and imagination. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany in the final months of the war, the Ghost Army found itself operating in a rapidly changing environment. Towns that had once been strongholds of Nazi control were now collapsing under the combined force of American and British advances. German soldiers were surrendering in large numbers, yet pockets of resistance remained dangerous and unpredictable. The war was shifting from orderly battle lines to chaotic fragments of collapsing defenses, and the Ghost Army had to adapt its methods to match this new reality. By early March 1945, American commanders were preparing for the final stages of the campaign. Intelligence reports indicated that Germany still had enough troops and artillery to inflict serious losses if the Allies attacked blindly. The Rhine River remained the last major physical barrier protecting the German heartland. Its fortified defensive positions, sharp bends, and treacherous currents made it one of the most difficult natural obstacles in Europe. German commanders expected the Allies to attempt a massive crossing, and they were certain to defend it fiercely. The Ghost Army's role during this period became more vital than ever. Their task was not simply to confuse the enemy but to shape the battlefield in a way that would make the Rhine crossing possible with minimal casualties. Every illusion they built, every sound they produced, and every fake message they transmitted had strategic consequences. Deception had become a core weapon in the final push toward victory. As preparations for Operation Viersen intensified, the unit began rehearsing techniques for creating illusions that could fool even desperate and highly alert German commanders. They had to think like the enemy, anticipating what German intelligence officers would expect to see and hear. They studied aerial reconnaissance photos, frontline reports, and intercepted German communications. They built deception plans that relied on subtlety rather than spectacle. After months of fighting, the enemy had become suspicious of anything that looked too perfect or too obvious. The Ghost Army understood that their illusions had to fit into the broader narrative of the war. If American divisions had been seen moving north, the Ghost Army could not suddenly pretend they were south. If artillery had been heard in one area the previous night, they could not simulate quiet the next morning. Their deception had to match movements and behaviors that German commanders already believed to be true. In this way, the Ghost Army slipped into the openings left by the shifting front lines, reinforcing German expectations and guiding them toward conclusions that benefited the Allies. During Operation Vierzen, the Ghost Army deployed nearly all of its asset. Inflatable tanks filled fields that had been empty only hours before. Fake artillery batteries appeared along ridges, positioned to resemble the firing arcs of actual U.S. units. Phantom truck parks stretched across farmland, complete with fuel barrels, ammo crates, and supply depots, all of them hollow constructs made from canvas and wood. Soldiers played their roles with theatrical precision, marching along predictable routes, speaking loudly in public spaces, and leaving behind fake maps and papers in places where German agents might find them. Everything was carefully choreographed. Tank tracks were carved into the muddy roads by dragging chains behind jeep. Footprints were stamped into the soil using wooden shoe blocks that mimicked the tread patterns of combat boot. Fires were lit every evening to make it appear as though troops were cooking meals in the open. The smell of burning food drifted across the plains, creating an atmosphere of normal military activity. At night, the sound teams blasted recordings of pontoon bridge construction, tanks idling, and trucks moving. The effect was overwhelming. To German scouts listening through the cold darkness, it sounded as if an entire army was preparing for a major assault. But the Ghost Army knew that illusion depended on constant motion. A fake division that stayed too long in one place would attract suspicion. German patrols routinely searched for signs of real troop strength, and if they noticed a lack of movement, the deception could collapse. This meant that the Ghost Army had to dismantle and rebuild illusions every few days, shifting the entire fictional army by miles at a time. One day they appeared to be gathering near the Rhine. 2 days later, they seemed to be advancing toward another position. The constant relocation kept German intelligence guessing, forcing them to question their own reports and reallocate forces accordingly. The success of the operation did not mean that the Ghost Army was immune to the dangers of combat. On more than one occasion, German artillery targeted their fake installations. Soldiers found themselves diving for cover as shells exploded among inflatable tanks and wooden structures. The sight of rubber tanks bursting under artillery fire was surreal, giant machines collapsing like children's toys in a storm. Yet such destruction was exactly part of the plan. If a German artillery crew shelled a fake tank battalion, it meant the deception had worked. Every shell wasted on an illusion was a shell not fired at real American troops. The Ghost Army's interactions with real Allied soldiers during this period were complex. Many frontline units had no idea that a deception force was operating nearby. When tank crews or infantry divisions passed a field full of what appeared to be artillery or armored vehicles, they often assumed reinforcements had arrived. In one case, a group of real American soldiers approached an inflatable Sherman tank and leaned against it while talking. Their weight caused the rubber structure to sag, and the tank nearly collapsed. The Ghost Army soldiers rushed over, laughing nervously, and redirected the men before the deception was exposed. Not all interactions were lighthearted. Some frontline troops considered the Ghost Army's mission strange or even dishonorable. To them, war was a matter of direct combat, not trickery. The notion that an entire unit existed to create illusions seemed almost unmilitary. But as the war progressed and the effectiveness of deception became clear, respect grew. Infantry commanders began to rely on the Ghost Army to protect their flanks or shield vulnerable positions. Tank units welcomed the added layer of secrecy provided by the Ghost Army's illusions. Over time, the unit's reputation spread quietly through the ranks, never officially acknowledged, but recognized by those who understood the stakes. The Ghost Army operated in secrecy so complete that even their families back home had no idea what they were doing. Letters home spoke vaguely of engineering duties, supply support, or administrative work. None of the soldiers could reveal the true nature of their missions. For the artists and creatives who made up the unit, this secrecy felt alien. Many had spent their civilian lives showcasing work to audiences. Now, their greatest performances had to remain invisible forever, hidden beneath the classification stamp of wartime intelligence. One of the Ghost Army's most remarkable qualities was their ability to remain calm under pressure. Deception required patience, precision, and the ability to control one's emotions. Soldiers trained to sketch landscapes could also sketch convincing military maps. Sound technicians accustomed to working with theater microphones learned to handle massive speakers capable of projecting sound miles across a battlefield. Painters who had once created portraits now painted camouflage patterns or unit insignia. Their talents were flexible, adaptable, and invaluable. As the Germans retreated deeper into their homeland, the Ghost Army often found themselves operating in environments that were both militarily and morally complex. Some towns they entered were devastated by bombings. Others were strangely untouched. Civilians ranged from openly hostile to cautiously friendly. In many cases, local populations had no idea what the Ghost Army was doing. Soldiers had to be careful not to reveal their purpose while still maintaining the illusion of being part of real American divisions. One of the most emotionally difficult aspects of this period was the discovery of concentration camps and forced labor sites. Although the Ghost Army's primary mission was deception, they were not insulated from the grim realities of the war. As Allied troops liberated camps and brought the horrors of the Nazi system to light, the men of the Ghost Army saw firsthand what the stakes of the conflict truly were. The illusions they created were no longer just tactical maneuvers, they were part of a broader fight against an evil that had inflicted suffering on millions. This realization strengthened their resolve. During the final weeks of the war, as American and Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the Ghost Army continued to support operations by misleading scattered German units attempting to reorganize. The enemy was fragmented, but still capable of launching deadly attacks. The unit's illusions helped keep German forces uncertain about Allied intentions, preventing coordinated resistance. In some areas, the Ghost Army impersonated divisions that did not even exist on the battlefield anymore, creating appearances of strength where American forces were thinly stretched. The psychological toll of this work was enormous. The soldiers lived in constant motion, rarely staying in one place long enough to feel safe. They endured artillery attacks, ambush threats, and extreme fatigue. Yet their creativity never faltered. Many kept journals filled with sketches of burning towns, abandoned German tanks, and the remains of their own inflatable machines torn apart by shrapnel. These drawings and writings would later become some of the most unique wartime art ever produced. When the German surrender finally came in May 1945, the Ghost Army was scattered across various locations in Central Europe. Some were still erecting illusions to protect the last Allied advances. Others had just finished dismantling their final installations. News of the war's end brought relief, joy, and a profound sense of disbelief. The Ghost Army had survived a mission that had no precedent and no clear rulebook. They had helped shape the battlefield without ever firing heavy weapons. Their courage lay not in direct confrontation, but in the imaginative, daring manipulation of perception. As Germany collapsed, the unit began the long process of packing up their equipment. Inflatable tanks were deflated and folded. Sound trucks were shut down. Fake headquarters were dismantled. For the first time in months, the soldiers paused to reflect on everything they had accomplished. They understood the impact of their work, even if no medals or public recognition would acknowledge it. Their missions had saved lives, thousands of lives, but their success depended on secrecy. They knew they could never tell the full story, not to reporters, not to their families, and not even to other soldiers. The U.S. Army classified all Ghost Army operations as top secret. The men were ordered not to discuss the unit for the rest of their lives. The records were sealed. The inflatable tanks, sound equipment, and radio logs were locked away. To the world, the Ghost Army did not exist. It was as if their work had been erased from history. But the soldiers themselves remembered. They carried with them a quiet pride, mixed with the strange feeling of having participated in something monumental yet invisible. Some returned to the art world, becoming famous painters, designers, and illustrators. Others entered film, advertising, and architecture. A few stayed in the military, applying their creative skills to new forms of intelligence work. Each man brought home a piece of the Ghost Army's legacy, a legacy built on imagination, courage, and the belief that deception, when used for the right reasons, could be a powerful tool for peace. When the war finally ended in Europe, the men of the Ghost Army prepared to return home with a quiet sense of accomplishment mixed with exhaustion. Germany lay in ruins. Towns were destroyed, bridges twisted into metal skeletons, and roads clogged with the remnants of a collapsing army. The Allied victory had come at a tremendous cost, and even though the Ghost Army had played a crucial role, few outside their circle would ever understand what they had done. Their mission required them to remain invisible not only on the battlefield, but in history as well. As their equipment was packed away, the soldiers watched the illusions they had built for months disappear one last time. Inflatable tanks were deflated and folded into crates. The massive speakers that once projected the roar of phantom armies went silent. Dummy artillery and wooden trucks were stacked and stored. It was a strange sight, an entire army vanishing back into nothingness, just as it had appeared from nothingness throughout the war. For the men who had lived inside this world of illusions, it felt almost surreal, as if their own identity as soldiers was dissolving with the rubber and canvas structures. The official orders were simple and stern. Everything they had done was classified. They were not to speak of their mission to anyone, family, friends, or even other soldiers. All records, photographs, sketches, sound tapes, and equipment were sealed under military lock. The Ghost Army was to become a secret known only to the highest levels of the U.S. military. The men accepted these orders, but silence carried its own burden. Many of them wanted to share their strange wartime experiences, not to boast, but to process what they had witnessed and what they had contributed. They had no battles to brag about, no heroic last stands to recount, no famous engagements to point to. Their victories had come from tricking an enemy rather than defeating them in direct combat. Their courage had been quiet, creative, and invisible. For some soldiers returning home, it was difficult to explain what they had done when asked about their service. They often gave vague answers. Engineering work, logistics duties, radio support. Few dared to speak openly about deception missions or inflatable tank. It was easier to say nothing. Many families never learned the truth until decades later. Yet the Ghost Army had left an unmistakable imprint on the men who served in it. Their wartime sketches, journal entries, and photos stored privately in their homes captured the strange duality of their experiences. These drawings showed burned-out European villages, makeshift headquarters covered in camouflage netting, inflatable trucks sagging in the rain, and soldiers in heavy coats standing beside rubber tanks painted to look like steel. These artworks became historical artifacts long before the public learned what they represented. As the men reintegrated into American life, their careers reflected the creativity that had defined their military service. Many became well-known artists, designers, and creative professionals. Bill Blass, who had inflated tanks in the Ghost Army, became one of the most famous fashion designers in the world. Ellsworth Kelly became a renowned painter and sculptor whose works would be displayed internationally. Art Kane became one of the most influential photographers of the 20th century. Their wartime experiences, working with illusions, color, shape, and visual deception, shaped their artistic identities in surprising ways. Others entered fields such as advertising, architecture, industrial design, film, and radio. They were used to thinking outside the conventional boundaries of their professions. The war had taught them that creativity could save lives, mislead armies, and influence events on a massive scale. This lesson stayed with them long after the uniforms were hung in closets and the medals placed in drawers. The Ghost Army's influence also extended beyond individual stories. Their operations demonstrated, perhaps more effectively than any unit before them, the importance of deception in modern warfare. Their techniques, visual illusions, sound deception, radio mimicry, psychological manipulation, would inspire future generations of military planners. The strategies developed by the Ghost Army became foundational principles for Cold War deception units, as well as for special operations forces tasked with misleading enemy surveillance networks. Yet despite all of this, official recognition lagged behind. 4 decades after the war, the Ghost Army existed only in sealed documents and the fading memories of its veterans. When some of the soldiers tried to share their stories with historians, they found that classified status blocked them from speaking openly. Even attempts to write memoirs or compile artwork were halted by secrecy laws. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, more than 40 years after the war, that the U.S. government began to slowly declassify pieces of the Ghost Army's history. As documents emerged, historians and journalists were stunned. The scope of the Ghost Army's missions, the audacity of their illusions, and the precision of their operations revealed one of the most remarkable untold stories of World War II. For decades, the world had believed that the Allied victories across France and Germany had been achieved solely through overwhelming force. Now it became clear that deception had played a crucial and highly sophisticated role. Interest in the Ghost Army grew. Veterans who were now elderly were finally able to speak openly about their service. Interviews, documentaries, books, and museum exhibits began to appear, revealing the full scale of what the unit had accomplished. Many of the soldiers expressed relief. After decades of silence, they could finally share their stories with their families. Some were surprised by how proud their children and grandchildren were to learn about their unique contributions. The public reacted with fascination. The idea of an invisible army, one that fought with rubber tanks and recorded sounds instead of bullets, captured the imagination of millions. People were astonished to learn that these illusions had shaped major battles and protected real troops from deadly engagements. The Ghost Army had never been designed to be celebrated, yet once its story emerged, it became one of the most memorable and uplifting examples of wartime ingenuity. Although recognition came late, it did come. In the 2010s, efforts began in the U.S. Congress to formally honor the Ghost Army for its extraordinary service. The process was slow, but momentum grew as historians and military leaders voiced their support. Finally, in 2022, the United States government awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest honors. For the surviving veterans, many of whom were nearly 100 years old, the ceremony was profoundly moving. Their secret sacrifices were no longer hidden. They were heroes acknowledged at last. The medal recognized the unit's unique and highly distinguished service in the war, honoring their creativity, bravery, and effectiveness. It also acknowledged the countless lives their deceptions had saved. The children and grandchildren of the Ghost Army veterans proudly attended the ceremonies, holding photos of their fathers and grandfathers standing beside inflatable tanks or sketching in their wartime notebook. It was a moment of closure, one that many veterans had hoped for but never expected to see. Today, the legacy of the Ghost Army stands as a powerful reminder that victory in war is not defined solely by firepower, numbers, or technology. Sometimes, victory depends on imagination, artistry, and the courage to think differently under pressure. The Ghost Army proved that deception, when executed with precision and purpose, could be as effective as any weapon. Their operations demonstrated that creativity can shape the course of history, even in the most devastating of conflict. Modern militaries now study the techniques pioneered by the Ghost Army. Psychological operations, electronic warfare, strategic deception, and visual camouflage all trace aspects of their doctrine back to the innovations of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troop. The unit's methods have influenced training programs, intelligence strategies, and battlefield planning across multiple nations. Yet despite this influence, no modern unit has replicated the Ghost Army's unique combination of artistic talent, improvisational skill, and wartime daring. Their story continues to inspire not just soldiers, but artists, filmmakers, writers, and students around the world. Museums display their inflatable tanks and sketches. Documentaries explore their operations. Books recount the strange missions that helped shape the Allied victory. School children learn that sometimes the most unexpected skills, painting, sound design, acting, can become powerful tools in moments of crisis. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of the Ghost Army's legacy is what it reveals about the human spirit. These were young men who used creativity to protect others. They walked into danger armed with rubber and canvas, trusting their intelligence, their wits, and their ability to mislead an enemy that outnumbered them in firepower. They carried no cannons, yet they commanded phantom divisions. They fired no artillery, yet they redirected enemy armies. They were surrounded by destruction, yet they used imagination as their shield. Their story stands as a rare and uplifting chapter in the vast, tragic history of World War II, a reminder that courage does not always appear in the form of violence, and that sometimes the most heroic acts are performed in silence, hidden from the world, waiting decades to be discovered. When the soldiers of the Ghost Army finally grew old and looked back on their youth, many described their wartime service not in terms of fear, but in terms of purpose. They believed they had done something meaningful, something that saved lives and shaped the outcome of the war. And although they had once been sworn to secrecy, their contributions now stand as one of the most extraordinary examples of how ingenuity, creativity, and bravery can combine to change the course of history. Their illusions faded long ago. Their inflatable tanks are quiet. Their sound trucks no longer roar in the night. But the legacy of the Ghost Army endures, a testament to the power of imagination in the face of overwhelming darkness, and a reminder that even in war, creativity can be a weapon as mighty as any steel machine.